Hello again, and welcome back to another edition of the Wiccan Conservative. Today, I am going to be bringing you part one of my two-part series, Religious Liberty. You may have heard through the mainstream media or popular news that apparently the Constitution is based on Judeo-Christian values. Well, throughout the next two episodes, I am going to prove to you that that is not true. If you look into the history of the Constitution, you will find that the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence was based on five notorious historical documents that begin their roots in the Anglo-Saxon region. To understand what exactly brought us to where we are now, we have to go back to the roots of the Anglo-Saxon people. And those roots prior to Christianity were pagan. So throughout this presentation, I plan to bring home the reason why the founding fathers did not make the Constitution a religious doctrine, but rather distinctively and decisively decided not to make the Constitution a religious document. So I hope that you guys enjoy the presentation, and let's get started. The first article on your screen comes from historynewyorkcourts.gov. It states that Anglo-Saxon scholar Patrick Worldmold urges that we bear in mind that dooms were never intended to represent the complete body of law that existed contemporaneously, and warns that the king's word had permanent significance, but only within the limitations of any verbal communication. That is, absolute integrity was dependent upon memory and was subject, as such, to adjustment, both conscious and subconscious. Written legislation was useful to aid memory and sometimes an impressive manifestation of the civilized status of its royal author, but it was not binding like modern statute law. So what Patrick Worldmold is getting at is the early beginnings of king rule, or rule by kingdom, came from the concept that what the king said was law. How did a king get king status, you ask? Well, he was born into his king status, which is what made him king, because God chose them as king. So we are going to start by exploring the dooms and what it meant to be a king in early Anglo-Saxon time. To understand how we came to accept such a doctrine, we have to understand how life evolved after the pagans started to taper off. This is the first part of the Dooms of the Kingdom of Kent. This is about King Ethelbert. He was around from 560 to 616 AD. The early settlements in England of the Angles and the Saxons were organized through customary law preserved by oral tradition. Legal historian Frederick Maitland states that the Magath kindred was the unit of common weal, controlling its members in many ways, and answerable for them in matters of both public and private right. A man's kindred are his avengers, and it is their right and honor to avenge him. So it is their duty to make amends for his misdeeds, or else maintain his cause in fight. Maitland continues, we have to conceive then of the kindred not as an artificial body or corporation to which the state allows authority over its members in order that it may be answerable for them, but as an element of the state prior to the state itself. There is a constant tendency to conflict between the old customs of the family and the newer laws of the state. The family preserves archaic habits, and claims which clash at every turn with a development of a law-abiding commonwealth. Step by step, the power of the state waxes, the self-centered and self-helping autonomy of the kindred wanes. Private feud is controlled, regulated, put, one must say, into legal harness. The avenging and protecting clan of the slain and the slayer are made pledges and the auxiliaries of public justice. So this is just the very small beginnings of the legal justice system and why we have prescribed measures of due process that exist now in our Constitution. Ethelbert came to the kingship of Kent in the year 560. His kingdom consisted of all the lands to the south of the River Humber. In 596, Pope Gregory the Great sent a group of monks to Kent by under leadership of Augustus. Prior to the monastery of St. Andrew in Rome and Augusta, Augustus converted Ethelbert to Christianity. Because the missionaries were also scribes, they introduced the written word into Anglo-Saxon England. In 602, Ethelbert and his Waitin Council issued the Dooms of Ethelbert. It is the earliest written code in any Anglo-Saxon realm. The Dooms were based on their customary law then in force in Kent, and the text survives as a 12th century copy manuscript known as the Dooms of Ethelbert. The Dooms contain 90 clauses written in Old English, and they reveal the complexity of Anglo-Saxon culture. The first several Dooms deal with the rights of the new church, but the remainder of the code is focused on crimes and breach of the king's peace. The Dooms are essentially a restatement of existing Anglo-Saxon legal custom, listing the weregild tariff to be paid by a wrongdoer in compensation for harm done to others. Ethelred's Dooms showed a society that was moving beyond blood feud to form a formal system of fixed payments by the wrongdoer to both the king and the injured party, or his Magna kindred. Scribes replicated the Dooms, and the documents were sent to the folkmoots, community gatherings that local affairs and administered justice. Unfortunately, Ethelbert's Dooms make no mention to the judicial procedure that applied in the folkmoot acting in its judicial capacity. So the very early beginnings of Anglo-Saxon doctrine started the foothold for the beginnings of the penal system in America. Our founding fathers started researching their work much later in 1014 under the first ruler of the Anglo-Saxon people, Ethelred the Unready. Ethelred the Unready's agreement of 1014 became to be known as the Anglo-Saxon Magna Carta. Magna Carta is seen as a turning point in English history and is commonly regarded as the first formal agreement between an English king and his nobles. It holds significant status both constitutionally and culturally, and rightly so. However, it is not the earliest written agreement between an English monarch and his subjects. Far from it. Exactly almost 2 centuries earlier, an exiled Anglo-Saxon king negotiated his way back into power thanks to an agreement that has been almost completely forgotten. The event has been so neglected that it does not even have an established name to go by. That is why the author is referring to this as the Anglo-Saxon Magna Carta. The Restoration Agreement is just one part in a larger puzzle of complex politics surrounding the Danish conquest of England from 1013 to 1016. Using the agreement as a starting point, it is possible to make sense of the events of one of the most dramatic eras in English history, when King Ethelred not only had to fend off massive Viking invasions, but also had to navigate through dangerous factions, disloyal subjects, and an open rebellion by his own son. The final agreement between Ethelred and the English nobles is summarized in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Then all the counselors, both spiritual and temporal, advised the king Ethelred should be sent for, declaring that no lord was dearer to them than their rightful lord, and if only he would govern his kingdom more justly than he had done in the past. Then the king sent his son Edward hither with his messengers, and bade greet all his people, and said that he would be a gracious lord to them, and would remedy each of the things they all abhorred, and everything should be forgiven that had been said or done against him, on condition that they all unanimously, without treachery, returned their allegiance. Then a complete and friendly agreement was reached and ratified, with word and pledge on either side, and they declared every Danish king outlawed from England forever. Then, during Lent of that year, King Ethelred came home to his own people and was received with joy by them all. So, going back to the founding fathers in Federalist Paper number 45, James Madison writes, "Thus each of the principal branches of the federal government will owe its existence more or less to the favor of the state government, and must consequently feel a dependence which is much more likely to beget a disposition to obsequences than to overbearing towards them." That just means that they used the principle of the small Anglo-Saxon communities in listing the representation of King Ethelred into the corporation of the idea of separation of powers. And you may be asking, why would this be relevant to religious liberty? Well, James Madison continued, "The number of individuals employed under the Constitution of the United States will be much smaller than the number employed under the particular states. There will be consequently less of personal influence on the side of the former than of the latter. The members of the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments of 13 and more states, the justices of peace, officers of militia, ministerial offices of justice, with all the county, corporation, and town officers, for 3 million and more of people, intermixed and having a particular acquaintance with every class and circle of people, must exceed beyond all proportion, both in number and influence, those of every description who will be employed in the administration of the federal system. Compare the members of the 3 great departments of the 13 states, excluding from the judiciary department the justices of peace, with the members of the corresponding departments of the single government of the Union. Compare the militia officers of 3 millions of people with the military and marine officers of any establishment which is within the compass of probability, or, I may add, of possibility, and in this view alone, we may pronounce the advantage of the states to be decisive." So he was explicitly clear in all of the areas in which to gather representation, but none of those areas stated to be acting members of the church or clergy. Furthermore, when examined, Article 1, Section 1 states, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives." Section 2 goes on to describe how the representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of most numerous branch of the state legislator. They also go further in section 3 to describe exactly how the Senate shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislator thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. And then they go on to describe how the United States Senate shall govern. Lastly, the powers of separation are cemented in Amendment 10. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, stating that under no certain circumstances should any other delegation of power be distributed to any other body, which would include the church. But let's go back to Ethelred. While Ethelred had some redeeming qualities, the Restoration Agreement makes it clear that nobles had grievances to address first. A. 1014-8, a sermon from Archbishop Wulfstan, complains that under Ethelred, the English had been weighed down by high taxes, oath breakers, and a government that is portrayed as arbitrary and corrupt. The Chronicles Agreement of 1014 likewise implies that Ethelred is personally unjust, perhaps due to the same issues mentioned by Wulfstan. It is also notable that the nobles sought protection against their old king. They were fully aware of the destruction a vindictive Ethelred could unleash on them. The Anglo-Saxon magnates had abandoned him just a few months earlier for a Danish usurper, after all, so they knew the king would perceive them as traitors. Even if Ethelred expressed forgiveness on the surface, securing a formal written pardon would better guarantee their safety, especially since Ethelred could be a ruthless, erratic leader at times. Aside from overseeing political assassinations, the king also orchestrated St. Briese's Day massacre in 1002, where he ordered all Danes in England killed. He had even opened his majority rule by raiding church lands in 986 after a political squabble with Bishop of Rochester. Although historians like Levi Roche note that Ethelred was not unusually reckless compared to other 11th century rulers, the nobles were still wise to secure their protection against him and his enforcer, erratic Estronia, the grasper. This highlights, again, the ability of the king to manipulate his own court at the time. The relationship between the kings and the church was a growing tension. Kings that came in and took over lands that were inhabited by people of conflicting religions were then put under religious tyranny. This was something our founding fathers did not neglect to notice when they wrote our founding documents. Before we go further into the bloody history of kings and the church, we have to look at the text and the type of wording that was being used at the time. Now, what I have on your screen is a decree from Ethelred's son. This is his decree as he was coming into power. In the name of Almighty God, I, the altering Athelstane, declare this document how I have granted my property and my chattels to the glory of God and for the redemption of my soul, that of my father King Ethelred, from whom I acquired it. I grant to that holy place for both our souls, and I entreat him that it may stand for the love of God and of Saint Mary and Saint Peter, and the sword with the silver hilt which Wulfric wrought, the golden belt and the arm ring which Wulfric wrought, and the drinking horn which I had bought from the community at Old Minster, Winchester. And I wish the money which Elthan Wood's widow owes me in payment, which I have advanced for her benefit, be taken and entrusted to Bishop Ethelslage and the old minister for my soul, that is 12 punds by tale. And I grant to Christ Church in Canterbury the estate at Hollingsburg, which belongs to it, except for one Soulange, which I have granted to Surfeth, and to the new minister a silver turgreen of 5 pounds in the name of the Holy Trinity, to which that place is dedicated. And it continues to go on with his bequeathments to the church. So if you were to look at these documents and notice the religious overtones, you would see that the founding fathers could have very easily made the case to write a Judeo-Christian doctrine into the Constitution. But as we go into the next part of this series, I will further illustrate exactly why they chose not to. So I hope you join me for the second part of this installment tomorrow, and I will see you guys tomorrow.